Homemade crumbs are going to taste better. You'll save money.
Don't leave crumbs.
Let's make breadcrumbs.
What would be really helpful is to try and maybe get a bit of an understanding in terms of the potted history of course architecture throughout the years. So kind of thinking about the different eras going right back to the golden age and how you see how that's evolved over the last sort of, 100 plus years, really, I guess.
It's interesting. So the first architects were pro golfers often, and it was really there was a lot of thinking around punishing bad shots. That sounded like it made sense. Just punish bad shots and reward good shots by having people hit the ball straight and hit it in the air. So there were lots of cross bunkers, across fairways that caught the top shots. It was a penal way of thinking about playing the game. The Mackenzie and Colt came along, and Mackenzie wrote golf architecture, and then the Spirit of St Andrews, which is essentially Doak rewrote the Spirit of St Andrews just in modern language and updated it. But he's really saying the same things. But Mackenzie was the first guy, one of the first to talk about George Tom Simpson. Let's make golf a little more interesting. Let's make it not about punishing bad shots, but about rewarding good shots. But giving the poorer players a way to play bogey golf, not by who wants to punish the worst shots of the poorest players. The most interesting part of the old course is how they figured out how to reward the best shots of the best players by having them skirt down the dangerous lines to open up the best lines into the flag. So Mackenzie and Colt and that generation ushered in the era of strategic design, really. So, and it wasn't about punishing bad shots, but more about rewarding good shots. So out of that, we got Cypress Point, Augusta. C.B. McDonald did the National Golf Links of America, which was the first great golf course in America, which was essentially, he went to Scotland and Britain and just copied the best of the links course and transported them over to Southampton in northern New York there. So that was really the first dramatic transformation. And you talk about the golden age. So Thomas and Tillinghast and Flynn were building all the great courses in America. Mackenzie was doing what he was doing down here. They'd done all the great Heathland courses in London. So then the Depression came and stopped everything pretty much. Augusta barely, was struggling pleading for members. Mackenzie never got paid, died penniless, 1933 or 4. Depression was 7 years, and the war came. All of the great Golden Age architects, that era died out. So then we got Trent Jones and Dick Wilson were the two famous guys in America, Hawtrey, I guess, in Britain. And it ushered in this new era of, as Peter Thompson called it, fins on Cadillacs, lakes, big long tees, signature holes, all that stuff that Trent Jones did in the 50s and 60s. And it was American, it was flashy. It was, it was starting to be the era when pro golf came to dominate the way people thought about golf courses and what was good design. The Golden Age era courses weren't that old. They were only 30 or 40 years old. So they hadn't grown to the stature that they enjoy now, because they were still seen as, kind of perhaps quaint or even old-fashioned. But here was this new modern age that was American, and it was, fins on Cadillacs, and it was everything American was great. Nothing was happening in Australia. Nothing was happening in England much, or Britain much, and America was where that was where all the work was getting done. And people came to see golf architecture as what it was, or good architecture as what they saw in their TVs from America. PGA Tour, Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, which kind of led to the era of the famous player architect. So Palmer got into the business, Nicklaus player. They were the big guys in the 80. And of course, Pete Dye was a huge influence on that era too. So Dye was a serious golf course architect who built his own work. Famously said that I watched what Trent Jones was doing and headed off in the exact opposite direction. And Harbour Town, which he did with Nicholas, was seen as the first kind of Trent Jones course. Smaller greens, compact, not flashy, but stuff built on the ground. Clever, strategic. A throwback to an earlier era, really. So, but the 80s, in fairness, ushered in the era of the famous golf course architect, where lots of stuff was built by. They were hired by people selling real estate. Famous names sold real estate. They were building tens of courses a year, all around the world. So how much time could they spend doing that? So they drew detailed plans. They gave it out to contractors. Contractors built the golf courses. They were pretty good. There were lots of BMWs built at the time, but Royal Melbourne and Sunningdale were Ferraris in contrast.
And these famous architects, they were kind of there for, the sort of ceremonial aspects of opening up the golf. They weren't hands-on, kind of overseeing. Yeah,
and these are kind of broad generalizations, but how much time could they spend on site? Whereas Pete Dye was famous for not drawing plans. It was someone turned up with plans one day and said, what do you want those for? I'm here every day. I don't need plans. So, and he trained young guys like Bill Corr and Tom Doak, and Gil worked with Tom and Gil Hans. So I guess we evolved into an era where a group of young kids, I'm calling Tom a young kid, he grew up watching how the business had developed and thought that perhaps the way the old guys did it was pretty good, spending time on site, working with shapers they knew, and that ushered in the era, which was, I guess, the first course you would look at was to point to the start of the modern era was Sandhills in Nebraska. So Bill Corr and Ben Crenshaw had this phenomenal piece of land in Nebraska, middle of nowhere, terrible model for a golf course, no real estate, only playable 5 months a year, but they built an amazing golf course that cost nothing to build. Mike Kaiser was an early investor and a member. Kaiser saw how well that worked. He was a wealthy greeting card guy, sold his business, had a passion for building great golf courses, went to Bandon in Oregon, built a big chunk of land on the ocean for not much money in the middle of nowhere. He told me, he said, everyone thought I was completely crazy. He said, it's too far away, no one will go out there. Hired David Kidd, who was a Scottish son of the greenkeeper at Glen Eagles, someone no one had ever heard of, gave him a chance and said, Kaiser said, well, if you screwed up, I could fire him without, costing me too much. So David did Bandon Dunes, people loved it, that worked. Hired Tom Doak to Pacific Dunes, that worked. Kid called Greg Ramsey rang me. He had a piece of land in Tasmania, in a little town called Bridport in the middle of nowhere. Well, it wasn't his land, but it was Richard Tatler's land. I went down there and looked at it with Bruce Hebner, who was building Cape Kidnappers for Tom in New Zealand. Kaiser eventually got Tom to come and have a look at it. Sorry, Tom came to look at it. Tom got Kaiser to come and look at it. Kaiser emotionally underwrote it and told Richard Sattler, Richard, go and build it, let these guys do what they want. So Barnbougle got built. If Dick Youngscap had never built Sandhills, Kaiser never would have done Bandon, and Barnbougle never would have got built. So here were these three kind of places in the middle of nowhere that no one ever thought had a chance of working that really worked. And they weren't built by famous golf pros. They didn't cost a lot of money, and they were incredibly successful. So, Gil Hans did Castle Stewart. Kings Barnes worked. So all these tremendous golf courses that were largely built on the models of what Colt and Mackenzie had done. Hands-on work done by great architects who weren't building a whole bunch of courses at at one time. They were spending their lives devoted to 1 or 2 or 3 projects a year. And pretty quickly, the world of, the small little world that is golf course architecture, I guess, started to realize that the stuff that, and it's been led by Bill Core and Ben Crenshaw, really. Or they determined that, Bill could have called the company, rather than calling it Core and Crenshaw, call it Crenshaw and Core, and they could have gone out and built 150 golf courses, probably. But they took a completely different model and said, we're only going to work with people we like, and we're only going to work on great bits of land. And by definition, that restricts the number of courses you're going to build, but it also gives you a chance to only build great golf and to build a reputation as being an architect who builds great golf courses. So Sandhills was 1993, so what are we, almost 30 years ago. And those guys have only ever done, perhaps not every course they've done is great, but they're pretty close to it. So 30 years on, 70 years from now, looking back, those guys are going to be as revered as Mackenzie and Colt and George Thomas and Tom Simpson are now, but because people are going to look back at their work and there'll be 40 or 50 courses, and every one of them will be awesome. Whereas if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, how many people are looking back at the golf courses that got built in that era and thinking, wow, they're awesome? There are a few, but not that many.